What do you get when you mix together 2 species of gooseberry with 1 species of blackcurrant? Well, in the 1920s, a German plant breeder started the multi-decade process of doing just that in order to produce this rather pretty berry bush called the yostaberry. We first learned about the yostaberry because we were interested in growing gooseberries for their health benefits. And those health benefits are real, they're pretty well established. I'll go ahead and link to some research in the description. Unfortunately, we didn't think that the gooseberry would do very well in our climate, but we decided, hey, we'll look at some varieties just to make sure anyways, and that's when we discovered the yostaberry. The yostaberry is the result of some very intentional hybridization that resulted in a very productive and disease-resistant berry bush with a flavor profile somewhere in between the tart blackcurrant and the rather sweet gooseberry. Today I'd like to walk you through some of the reasons that we decided to add the yostaberry to our berry lineup and some of the factors that are going to go into making it a thriving addition to the garden. You know, right off the bat, it's quite a pretty plant, don't you think? The foliage is interesting and unique, and honestly, I think that matters because, like many berry bushes, the yostaberry isn't going to produce, at least not significantly, for at least a couple of years. So we want it to at least look nice in the meantime. Even better than being pretty, it is resistant to a number of diseases that plague other plants in the genus, such as gooseberry mildew. Unfortunately, there are precious few full sun locations left at our house, which means that we also needed something that would thrive in partial shade, which the yostaberry will due to its blackcurrant heritage. Unlike this heritage red raspberry, the yostaberry was intentionally bred to be thornless, so you can feel free to put it somewhere with lots of foot traffic. Actually, let's take a closer look so I can show you what I mean. Whenever possible, we try to prioritize plants that are self-fertile, and the yostaberry fits that bill, so long as you go with the original yosta variety and not one of the newer ones. Pro tip, if the variety is not listed, it is almost certainly that original variety. The newer ones are still relatively uncommon, at least in the United States. Now, the main downside, at least for us, is that the yostaberry requires about 1,000 chill hours, or hours where the temperature is under 45 degrees Fahrenheit. That's really pushing in our zone, and realistically, this plant would probably do a little bit better somewhere with cooler winters and cooler summers.
All right, let's talk a little bit about planting conditions. In terms of soil composition, I'll be honest, there is a lot of conflicting information out there. On average, consensus is that a yostaberry will tolerate wet feet better than something like a raspberry, but prefers slightly acidic soil and will tolerate even moderately alkaline conditions. That's great for those of us with challenging alkaline clay soil because I do eventually want to transplant this into the ground. For now, we're using our typical DIY potting mix here with a little extra sphagnum peat moss for acidity. I'll add a link to instructions on that mix, but the key point is it's very high in organics, like compost and aged manure. In terms of planting, there's no special depth requirements, just match the soil level. I'm intentionally leaving a lot of room below the lip of the container, more on that in a second. As always, I've also added a couple of scoops of worm castings to introduce beneficial bacteria and add micronutrients. Unfortunately, it is common to run into issues with these plants not setting fruit well or even at all. And while reasons vary, one major cause is they tend to prioritize vegetative growth in the presence of a lot of nitrogen. That's the case with a lot of fruit trees, really. It's why we have to be thoughtful with these plum trees planted at the edge of our grass lawn. They'll grow big, but set little fruit if you feed them like a lawn. Given that we don't expect our little yostaberry to really fruit for even a year or two, root and vegetative growth is okay with us. So I've added some diluted, balanced fertilizer to the mix. Next spring, I'll add either berry fertilizer like one from Espoma or any other generic mix that's weighted towards potassium. Or, like often, we'll skip all the fertilizer and just use a whole lot of compost and aged manure. Finally, just water it in generously to ensure good contact between the roots and the new growing medium. I always add a layer of wood chip mulch after planting, but this time I've left room for an extra thick layer to help keep these roots cool during our agonizing summer temperatures. Temperatures that this plant is frankly not built to handle.
So our short-term plan is to help this little fellow thrive by placing it into this sheltered, shady location. once we get a better feel for how it's actually going to hold up to our very hot summers, we do plan to transplant it into the ground. The reason being is that the yostaberry can very quickly grow over 6 feet tall and over 6 feet wide and has a very deep, robust root system. That's really one important reason that we planted it in not just such a wide container, but a very deep container. I want to impede that root growth even in the first year as little as possible. Otherwise, a trellis system is probably not necessary for the hardy, fast-growing yostaberry bush. That is, unless you wish to espalier yours, which is definitely an option. One final note. Birds tend to love small berries like the yostaberry, and we are very fortunate to be visited frequently by a number of charming bird species who would very happily pick a berry bush like this one completely clean before we get anything off of it. So just know that you may need to net the plant as those berries begin to mature. Honestly, I can never accept that a plant is just not going to work in my garden until I at least give it a try, particularly plants that I'm very interested in, but I think that's a pretty common trait amongst gardeners. We're a rebellious sort of folk. More often than not, I am very glad that I decided to at least experiment with a plant that is perhaps borderline for my zone. All right, that's it. I hope this was helpful and perhaps a little bit interesting. If you did get something out of the video, please consider liking it or even subscribing to the channel. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.